So I give the speak. I called to speak our colleague, Professor Tsoulfidis, Professor of Economics, if I'm right, a Professor of Economics in the University of Macedonia in Salonika. He will continue this very interesting comparative perspective introduced by Professor Maurice Emar, continued by Matthias Morris, and now we have the presentation of the Lefteris on the subject, if I am permitted, the interwar depression and the Greek economy, lessons learned and not learned, those lessons that we are always asking about.
Hello, everybody. I wish to start by thanking the organizers of this conference, and in particular, Caterina Bregani, for inviting me here to present my topic, which is about the interwar depression and the Greek economy. And I will try to speak about lessons that we learned and perhaps we did not learn. Usually people or historians or economists that they talk about the Great Depression or the interwar depression, they refer to just a single year, such as the year 1929, when we had the fall or the collapse of the stock market in New York. Or sometimes they expand the time period to include the year 1932. So 1929, 1932 is the period of depression, and everything, all other years are fine. We don't have to worry about this. The truth is that, or in my view, what really have to deal with is with the whole period that starts from 1896 and ends with World War II. This is a period, a long durée that we had before, or a long cycle if you want. I'd rather use the term cycle or wave if you want, with two phases. One phase that starts in 1896 and ends with World War I, and then from 1920s onwards until the end of until the beginning or the end of World War II. So these are two long periods with particular characteristics that we usually see in the US mainly, and whatever happens in the US, I think even today, affects the whole world. And Greece in particular, the country that we will focus afterwards. There are many theories that have been tested and tried to explain the period, the depressionary, so to speak, period. We have monetaries, we have Keynesians, we have Austrian theories, we have Marxian theories, variants of all these theories. And we have also another theory, a new classical sort of theory that argues that there was neither depression nor unemployment. People did not want to invest, they wanted to save their money for reasons that have to do with their expectations about the future. And people did not offer their labor services precisely because they felt that the wage is not worth their services. But before we continue to the depressionary period, we need some background. And first of all, we need to clarify that the period of 1920s, which is usually characterized as roaring 20s, they were not so, there wasn't any good, healthy, so to speak, growth. And many things were based on credit and not on developments on the real economy. In 1920s, most European countries experienced severe unemployment, and mainly Germany was in a very bad situation. Austria, that we heard before, was in a terrible situation with hyperinflation, rising unemployment. Unemployment in Germany at some point in 1932, if I recall, reached the level of 44%, which is unbelievable with current standards. In the US, in the meantime, we had the Dewey Plan, which, and according to which US banks were encouraged to lend money to German banks, so Germany could perform, or four functions could be performed. First was that the German economy, in the German economy, there will be enough money to increase imports from the US. At the same time, to maintain social order through welfare programs that were in place. And the third, which is perhaps most important of all, because it connects with other countries, Germany would be able to pay war reparations to France, and in particular to the UK. And of course, Greece was also a country that had expectations about receiving something from these war reparations. The war reparations also helped the UK and France, and in particular the UK, to be able to pay its her inter-alliance loans to the US, because the US during World War I lent a lot of money to England and to France and other countries, so as they will be able to carry out the war. These four functions became possible through the monetary policy followed in the US, which was an easy money policy, easy monetary policy, so increasing money supply, and at the same time keep interest rates low, so to make all this scheme workable, meaning that the US banks had an interest to lend money to German banks whose interest rate was higher, and also lend money or save their money in England, because England at that time had appreciated its pound, because returning to the gold standard wanted to tie pound to the old currency, to the old exchange rate with gold. And that was above the equilibrium, so to speak, in the exchange rate. And that was possible only with higher interest rates in England, higher than the US interest rates. So the whole thing looked that it worked, and worked for some years. But from 1928, the US banks felt that they lent a lot, they reached a saturation point, and then stopped lending anymore, or to the same extent as in the past. Meanwhile, the easy money policy and the low interest rates, combined with the falling profitability, which is a real fact, and I will show you that later, led to low investment, and also the easy money policy became the fuel that was necessary to build two very important bubbles: the real estate bubble and the stock market bubble, which burst in the third quarter of 1929. I think this situation is not quite different from that in the year 2007, 2008. Since the US banks were not lending or depositing money in Germany, the German economy came in a difficult position, could not import the same amount of imports as in the past. At the same time, Germany imposed restrictions in foreign exchange, kept large amounts of pounds in its own banks, and stopped paying its war reparations. This was a disaster for the UK, France, and other countries that owed inter-alliance debt, and so essentially they defaulted. I mean, the UK defaulted its loans to the US, but it's not a default as usual. They called it excusable default because England did not pay because Germany did not pay. So England was excused. England was out of the gold standard, as was said before, by September in 1931, and the US abandoned the gold standard 2 years later in the year 1933. Greece was expected also from war reparations and new loans, which did not come. Here, I try to show the rate of profit in the US, which we see its falling pattern. There is no doubt that we have two different periods, two different phases, and also the interest rate and also the growth rate of GDP, which I don't have here, but if I had it would give these two different phases. We see that the long run interest rate in the US was rising up until the 1920s. I think something similar was up until 1982 in the more recent years, and then started its falling pattern. I think falling profit rate and very low profit rate and falling interest rate and low interest rate are what are the conditions to have bubbles. Here we have a picture of the total profits in real terms, of course, which follow an S pattern, a logistic pattern, and the inflection point, that is to say the phase change, so to speak, is in the year 1914, and the saturation comes in the mid or early 1920s, which is the situation that we described before, and shows that we have a depressionary period. If this picture is not convincing, the next picture of quarterly net profits of all of corporate quarterly net profits of the US from 1920 to 1938 shows a better picture because we have also negative profits, and negative profits doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that do not promote investment. One of the last figures in this part of the presentation is the one that you see here, which is the price index of two countries, the US and Greece. And I think, or not I think, I'm sure that I know that for sure, that the same picture applies to all countries, England, France, whatever country you want to take. So these price indexes are wholesale price index divided by the price of gold. It is true that up until World War II, rising prices indicated a booming economy, and falling prices indicated a recessionary economy. And this is what we get for the two countries in comparison. The red line is the US, that we see the phase change in the 1920, and the blue line is Greece, which and Greece has the same behavior. The dashed lines are the trends, which trends also led support to the view of the two phases of the long cycle that started in 1896 and continued to the Second World War. Now, focusing on Greece and her data, I must say that Greece did not suffer so much from the depression in 1920s as she suffered from the disaster of Asia Minor in 1922, where more than 1 million people came to Greece, Greek refugees, that made up 1/4 of the total population. This is an expansion of population without precedence, I suppose. And this increase in population, the refugees themselves mobilized the state apparatus in unbelievable ways, and also the League of Nations that instituted the Refugee Settlement Commission that were very active and accommodated this population. At the same time, the Greek government instituted an industrial policy, which of course could not be carried out without foreign loans and foreign funding. But we must say that the increased population in and of itself was enough to create conditions for economic growth. And these were the reduction in wages, because surplus population depressed real wages. And this is something that we can see in data that I don't have to show you here, but we can find them. Second, many of the refugees that came here carried with them entrepreneurial abilities, and they introduced new products in Greece. These became exporting products, and this also created conditions, economic conditions worth discussing. And the growth of demand through the higher population promoted economic activity. So there was some growth, okay? But this growth doesn't mean that there was no poverty. Poverty was widespread. People were living in very poor conditions. And the growth was not something that was quite a healthy, so to speak, growth. In the end of the 20s, in the year 1928, we had a number of important institutional changes. And among these, the Bank of Greece, the Central Bank of Greece, because up until that time we did not have a central bank, but 4 or 5 banks that they had the right to issue their own money. And this was a condition sine qua non for Greece to receive new loans through the mediation of the League of Nations or through the League of Nations. In October of 1929, we had a collapse in the stock market in New York. The Athens Stock Exchange continued its operation, but I don't think that important things were happening there. I mean, it was opened through government support. Government supported banks to buy stocks, and especially the stock exchange was opened so we can have exchanges of gold. The UK, we said, abandoned the gold standard. I don't know how come Greece would stay in the gold standard, but people then, politicians there, the government at that time thought that it would be a good idea to continue on gold standard, but in fact, we had the gold exchange standard with the base, the pound. But then we said, or the Greek government said, let us leave pound and go to the dollar, and so follow the dollar exchange standard, which was an idea that people or foreign countries will see that we are a serious country and we follow rules and we are trustworthy, and so that we can borrow more money. This was an idea, but could not continue. I mean, the central bank faced many difficulties because the central bank was in a fight with the commercial banks from the very beginning because they didn't want the central bank. They wanted their independence, and they transferred their foreign exchange out of the country in an effort to take advantage of the possible depreciation of the drachma, which was expected. And also they pretended that they want to buy Greek stocks and Hellenize, so to speak, the Greek debt and so forth. But their goal was very clear. Meanwhile, Greek exports decreased through the European depression. The Greek exports were tobacco, raisin, olive oil, and these things. And remittances of the Greeks in the US, which were an important asset for the Greek economy, ceased to come in the same extent. I mean, we had the reductions, and funding from abroad was difficult, and so the ambitious program of public investment of the government to carry out was cut off. All these developments in a very short period of time, so in 1932, in April, led to the default of the Greek government, and that came as a result of Venizelos, the prime minister at that time, that tried to contract a new loan through the League of Nations, but the League of Nations thought that the Greek government is not serious at this time, wants to export its own problems to other countries, and refused to lend. They made some recommendations which the Greek government could not accept. The default came the April of 1932, but this default was a good one in a sense, because those that they were in possession of Greek bonds were mainly foreign banks and individuals, that they did not have any power to do anything. Foreign international governments were very much involved with their own problems to pay much attention to Greece. And so the default of Greece was accompanied by payment of 1/4 of interest to domestic banks. At the same time, protection policies were applied. And the end result of all these were, and so there was a lot of surplus in the budget. Revenues were more than expenditures, government expenditures, and Greece perhaps is the only country in the world that in the year 1932 had a real GDP higher than that of the year 1929. And I will show the data later. This, again, I have to stress, doesn't mean that the economic situation in Greece improved in any meaningful way for the people. People were living in conditions of poverty, no question about it. The the general sense of the state of the economy was depressive, and the numbers though were doing well, some of them, not all of them. So here we have an index of agricultural production. This is gross output, okay? Because the GDP doesn't increase so much as the gross output, whatever that means exactly in agricultural production. This is the public revenue to public expenditures ratio, the red line, which from 1932 improves. I mean, we have surplus. Before we also had surplus, but we have to include in the revenues the loans. Here we have the debt to GDP ratio, which is quite high, but is falling after the year 1932. I guess it's not the debt that decreased, but rather the GDP increased and made the difference. The government expenditures as a percentage in the GDP is quite high with the standards of that period. If you think that in the US, the average government expenditures to GDP is 10%, then in Greece is at least twice as high. Here we have the GDP data. The red line is the total GDP, which is rising, and we shouldn't take this very seriously because we have the annexation of new areas, new countries, so to speak. So Macedonia and Thrace were included, and that increased GDP by itself after the year 1912, but also the refugees made some difference, quite a big difference. So it is more reasonable, although I have my second thoughts about it, to divide by, to take the GDP per capita, which if we, the green line, and if we look at it, we observe that there hasn't been any significant change from the year to what is this 1910. Although from 1930, 1920s or so, increases steadily. This table is my so to speak construction, and must you shouldn't take it literally, because what I have here is two censuses, the year 1928 and the year 1940, where I have the active population, that is to say people above 8 years and below 65 years, men and women. In the years between, I have interpolations, so this straight line from the year 1928 to 1940. The number of unemployed is given by the statistical service, whatever that is. And the rate of unemployment is the number of unemployed over active population. This is not unemployment proper, as you understand. But if we think a little bit about it, we get a very good sense of unemployment, because in the active population, we have agricultural workers, men and women. And agriculture in Greece in that period of time is about 45, 50%, perhaps more. And this immediately tells me that I have to multiply this unemployment rate by 2, at least. If we think also that public employees, they're not unemployed, then this figure increases even more. So unemployment, we can tell, was very, very serious. And we don't talk about conditions of employment, because we have to think that we have surplus population, the power of the employers is very high, and they impose lower wages, higher, longer working hours, and so forth. And poverty is the sense we get from the statistics and also the literature of that period of time that shows that people were living in very bad conditions. Here we have an index of industrial production, which is very interesting to pay a little bit attention. And we have Greece that is the only country in the years 1929, 1932 with positive figure. All others are negative. If we see the whole period, 1929-37, Greece's index of industrial production is second only to Japan. This is quite interesting. I mean, I was surprised looking at it. And another interesting thing, which is aside, the table was not for that, but it's very, very interesting, is Germany's performance in the year 1937, which is the top economy. And one is wondering what happened to this economy, what kind of policies did these people apply, and how come they had such a growth performance. So this is a time that we have to study more carefully to see what kind of policies were applied, and they gave such good performance. This is a picture of Index of Economic Activity of Supreme Economic Council. I don't know much about it, but I have seen this index appearing many, many times in different. The idea is the following, that Harvard University has an index that included many sectors, and something like that was applied to the Greek economy. Some people have complained that agriculture is not included. If it were included, it wouldn't be so good. But you know more about it, I suppose. And but the general picture is not in deviation, I would say, from the GDP picture. So must be looked in the same spirit. And about to close my presentation, I don't know if I have more time. I would like to share with you two very interesting quotes. One is from my former late Professor Robert Heilbronner, who says something that I hear, I see appearing repeatedly, and that is before of every crisis, speakers or politicians come out, or economists come out, and they say that, don't worry, the fundamentals are right, everything is fine, and this is temporary, okay? Irving Fisher's quote, I guess, is the best of all. Okay, when he was asked, what do you see in the stock market? And he said, the sky is the limit. Okay, and the next quote is also quite interesting, and this is from Bernanke, who in the 90th birthday of Milton Friedman, he said to me famous, okay, we won't do it again, okay? This is what I pay attention. I mean, there are other things that we can see. And I have here some concluding remarks, which I cannot finish. I mean, let me go over this carefully. One thing that I have to say is that economic crises and depressions are regularly appearing stages of long cycles. In retrospect, long depressionary stages were those of 1820s, 1830s. Okay, the dates are not exact, but just to give you a sense. 1870s, 1880s, 1920s, 1930s, 1970s, 1980s, 2010s, 2020s, to the 10s. Okay, I have it there. During these stages, we have major innovations. Okay, so crisis doesn't mean that they don't leave their mark. I mean, we have major innovations, and doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure them out. And major institutional changes. I have to say at this point that major institutional changes that we observe nowadays in the European Union are institutional changes that are owed to Greece. Okay, because if we didn't suffer all these troika policies, then I think the institutions that were in place were institutions designed for prosperity, not crisis. People did not believe in crisis during that period of time. Okay. Regrettably now. And this is true, I mean, in every period, such as, for instance, depressionary periods, or after the depression, people forget about the depression. I'm sure that the current state will be forgotten after a while. I mean, if we go to the next stage, suppose that we do that, okay, then there will be, then the depressionary period will be forgotten. So in the 60s, we had the mixed economy. I mean, people were speaking, were very positive that depressions are things of the past because we now know. And because we know, we are not going to repeat. And in the 1990s, we had the new economy, because the new economy of the Internet of Things and the Internet in general, we have all the information that we need, and don't worry, I mean, depressions do not exist because of the new economy. Okay, so for Greece, we say that 1920s were bad because not so much of the depression, but because of the refugees crisis, the Asia Minor disaster. In 1928, things looked that are in order and we are doing well, but the worst was, but then the crisis came. We experienced that. But protectionist policies that were applied, the abandonment of the policy of the hard, so to speak, drachma of that period, created conditions of economic growth. And people were living in poverty, but the numbers were doing very well at that time. The Central Bank of Greece assumed more power because of the depressionary period, because also assumed the exchange rate market. Resources were released because of the default. We didn't have to pay foreign lenders, and so revenues were accumulated and could be spent in public investment programs, mainly in infrastructure. I think, thank you for listening, and I mean, this doesn't end, but at some point I have to stop.
It's an old subject, no? Okay, thank you, Lefteris, for this presentation, which in fact evokes, underlines a lot of facets on the interwar depression. I mean, it's very, for me, it's very interesting, the comparisons with, say, economy and the indexes concerning the different, the evolution of the economy in the 20s and 30s, different countries. And we can remark that maybe Greece, as nowadays, at the time was also a country I don't want to say a country in a financial abnormality, but of course a country in problems, put manifested also by the effort to settle the refugees, and this is the beginning of the, I think, the beginning of the entrance of Greece in transnational financial sphere, let's say, via the loaning from the League of Nations. And if I can underline your remarks, we have, of course, it is important to say that according to the archival material also, not only the literature, let's say, according to archival material, the bankruptcy of 32, it was not so much, it was not, I mean, the European opinion did not take so bad the Greek bankruptcy. In a way, they found the state's bankruptcy as normal, as the normality of the early 30s. That was, as you pointed out, the problem. The problem was with the private debt. That turned also to drachma, so they lost, in fact, their investments. So it was not a problem. Maybe we can say that it was a problem of private indebtedness and not a problem of the public debt. In terms of course, of representation and not in real terms. What I wanted to also to point out, it is the role of, as you already said, the role of the Bank of Greece concerning the enactment of the international, in fact, the enactment of they had the monopoly of the exchange rate, so in a way they were responsible for the enactment of the international, in a way, of international trade. But on the other hand, we have to say that they played an important role in the bankruptcy as the couverture, the reserves in gold under, as I said before, under the supervision of the League of Nations, were about to decrease already in 1928, from the beginning of the stabilization. Not so much in 1928, but already from 1928. And this was a case discussed in the financial committee of the League. I think it's very important because it was before the Great Depression, this issue of the Greek financial irregularity. From I think the problem began at early, in fact, late 1928, almost a few months after the stabilization. So maybe we can see that in both ways, economic way and historical way, because it is rather interconnected, I think. At the end, I want your opinion there. For me, all this procedure of the Greek economy, of this performance of the Greek economy until the bankruptcy. After that, it is changed. Its role is changed. But until the performance of the Greek economy, until up to the 32 bankruptcy, is very connected to the asymmetry I advocated earlier, the symmetry in the framework of the monetary zone. So this was a remark that Angelopoulos and two economists of the interwar period, they made also this remark, not with this term asymmetry, but saying that being in the gold standard, we had όχι ο Βαρβαρέσος, όχι, ο Αγγελόπουλος και ο Πετηλής, so it was not the dominant opinion, but there was this opinion also during the interwar period with other points, of course. So I'm stopping here because we will never end with this subject. Is really huge.
Okay, we tried to make the connection, but I'm afraid that I don't have much to say. But these have been discussed, these issues have been discussed. I think it was a terrible mistake from the part of the government in 1932, a terrible mistake. I understand why they did that, but they had inside information that England leaves the gold standard for good, not temporarily. And that was something that Keynes himself said to the Greek representative in England, Varvaresos, and Varvaresos have sent an email, a telegraph, a telegraph telling to Venizelos that they are serious. I mean, they are going to stay out of the gold standard. Don't try anything.
Don't try to stay attached to
the British ambassador or the British representative to the central bank in Greece also said the same thing to Venizelos, but he did not listen to. I mean, his government. Okay, don't blame everything to him. His government did not listen. I mean, they thought that if they apply policy of hard drachma, they will be appreciated from lenders, foreign governments. They will say that this country is serious, and
serious one.
He believed. He seemed that he believed that we are a family of countries, and one country tries its best, and the other countries must respect that and be generous or be lenient to the demands of the government. And in fact, he tried to extract the loan. He went, stopped to Italy, Venizelos, stopped to Italy, went to England, to France, England, and there was a no from all these governments. And the idea is that the climate changed. The climate was completely different. It was a climate of autarky in all Europe. And this is something that Greece also applied a little bit later.
was necessary for the survival.
Survival.
I think.
Everybody looks for his own.
Yes, in the 30s, but maybe we and it's important that Venizelos thought that the link would give a new loan to Greece, a new international loan with the same profitable conditions like in the 20s, because as you said, it was another completely different period, so it was not possible that the same conditions could be applied for the new Greek program, lending program. Let's say it's a bit. This can be compared, I think, with the current crisis. I mean, the country was not really appreciated in the international institutions. So they declare very hard conditions that, and this is the opposite, that the Greek government of the period, Venizelos, and then Papanastasis, they couldn't accept them. It was really hard for the political climate. So I don't know. This could be an internal discussion.
But you are right. There are important parallels of that time period with the current one. The previous speaker also brought this parallel.
This parallel, yes.
And we see that the same, or at least up until a point, we saw that not isolationism, but the idea that there is competition between countries. I mean, we cannot say that we are a family and you will be good, you won't spend, and if you do that, then you will be like us. I mean, this is
absurd. But I mean, also the political implementation in the Western Europe was also, we can find some parallels, I think. But at the time, from the press I read, mostly French or Swiss press of the 30s, there were not such a depreciation for Greece like in the current crisis, and this is a bit, for me, it's a bit curious. Let's say. I mean, that demonstrates that this solidarity that it was not existing in the 30s, but even more, it does not exist in our present period, in our times. And so it's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit stressful for the Western civilization. I mean, this can be a bit shocking. I mean, the position, the international position of the Greek state in the 30s, and the geopolitical position of Greece in, I don't know, after I don't know, I'm not political science, but from the attitude of the international institutions to the Greek state, or to the representatives of the Greek state, I can see that it was a lot more appreciated at the period, and maybe for this, Venizelos had the confidence that they finally will give him, they would give, sorry, they could give him the new land, the new capital, the new loan. But this is not, of course, it's not, of course, let's say scientific. It's only some hypothesis to be tested. But it's for me, it was a bit impressive.
Personalities played no role in that in those times.
I think also because we know that from that Great Britain wanted Greece in its sphere, its
sphere of influence.
Yes, I think it was a necessity for Great Britain to so as to control the Eastern Mediterranean, especially after the Asia Minor expedition. I don't know, maybe Michali? We cannot hear you.
Yes, I mean, they say that the Soviet Union had some enormous expansion in production, and they did not suffer from the crisis as the Western, so to speak, countries. This is what the data that we have shown. And yes, but how reliable are the data? Okay, and conditions that people were living is also important. But speaking strictly in numbers, yes, you're right. I mean, the Soviet Union during that period of time displayed the top growth rates higher than those of Japan and higher than those of Greece. Greece was the third one.
But maybe for the Soviet Union, I would like to say that because it's rather curious. In the first place, until 1923, they participate in the monetary conferences with representatives.
Really?
Yes. And in some positions, let's say they have the same position with Greece. I mean, concerning the protection, the aspects of tariff. 23. After that, no, okay, it's until 1923. I haven't found any Soviet representative, but I found until 1923, and they were rather moderate. I mean, okay, it's normal because it was an international forum. They were rather.
They had very good economies.
Of course.
During that period of time. Some of them we know, like Leontiev, was very young.
Kuznet. Please explain why they were there and how they could negotiate. Of course.
It's a very quality analysis from Mr. Tsoulfidis, very adapted to the data, and I have not anything.
I hear you, yes.
Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Maybe it was this question before that Lefteis put to you about the price index and hyperinflation, hyperinflation index. So I don't. I would like to give you the possibility, the time to answer on this question, because we didn't have the time earlier. If you want to respond to that, it could be instructive for all of us.
Can you open the? I want to show you two slices, if possible.
Yes.
What I showed you in the presentation board was this: the Austrian crown against the Swiss franc at the foreign exchange in Zurich. That's the development of the devaluation. And if you look at the consumer price index, I think that's yeah. You see the inflation up to the end of 1922-23, and then you have constant consumer price since 1924-25. So that's what I could show you. I'm not quite sure what was your question, because I can't understand your people very well. So we had two positions in Austria. One was the money quantity theory, and the other was the argument the constant budget deficit was the reason why we had this enormous inflation. There were the two positions. And for instance, orthodox liberal economists and politicians such as Alexander Spitzmüller, he was the president of the Austro-Hungarian Bank before World War I, or Viktor Kienböck, he was president of the Austrian Central Bank in the 1930s. In favor for the quantity theory in this time. And most historians have seen this the inflationary finance of war costs after 1914 as the initial cause of Austrian inflation. The government financed their expenses and deficits with domestic public loans and state money creation through the National Bank that had suspended their bank rates. And the two prominent Austrian economic historians, Bachinger and Mattis, regarded the result of the appalling disproportions of the massive increase of the money supply and the continuous lack of goods at the same time as a cause for inflation. But I'm not sure if I did understand your question right, because I have problems with the loudspeakers here.
I asked a question and I think you answered it. And okay, I mean, we have a consumer price index which after 1924 was steady.
Yeah.
If I recall the figure, and the
Oh.
first figure was what? It was a price index or inflation?
Foreign value of the Austrian crown.
Okay. All right. And the hyperinflation, you said that we have two views. First, quantity theory of money, and the second was?
Second was that the continuous deficit of the Austrian
Okay. So
Austrian
we have to use
central
which
government.
we find in every hyperinflation. Okay. Thank you.
And the second one was were only it was the argument of those people who voted for the Anschluss to Germany.
By the way, I may add something here. In Greece, there is an argument that has not been public yet. It's not my argument. A friend of mine makes it, that there was no gold in the vaults of the central bank.
In the 40s, in the 30s.
In the 40s.
In the 30s or in the 40s?
In the 40s. We're speaking about hyperinflation.
This is true. Huh?
There was no gold. Can we say the same thing for Austria? Was there gold in the vaults of the central bank or the? Huh?
Well, some were members of the Catholic Church, but yeah, okay. If this was not sufficient, maybe we exchange this discussion via email, or maybe my mic and my
But
speakers are better tomorrow. The connection is very poor.
in any case, the Greek gold in the 40s is a completely different story than the 30s. It's in another context. The efforts for money, for currency stabilization in the 40s in Greece. But so it's not, I don't think that it is connected, but we can exchange emails. So this matter is very interesting for me too. Okay, maybe, so maybe if we don't have any other comments,